have Andrew Whitehead with me. And Andrew, you are Associate Professor of Sociology at Indiana University, Purdue University in Indianapolis. And by the way, I used to go to Indianapolis all the time because I went to seminary there. And I just was telling you that a couple months ago I was in Indianapolis for a work thing. So I feel like Indianapolis is sort of like a second home. I often describe it as like the most mediocre city in America, and
So
it's like
true.
embraced in that way.
So
Like
true.
people from Indianapolis love how mediocre Indianapolis is. Am
Yeah.
I like wrong there? It feels like that though, right? At least.
No, no, it is so vanilla that like when companies want to get a handle on like what might most Americans in the median think, they come here and just see what people here think, and then they're like, well, for most people anywhere else, it'll hit. So it's like the chain restaurant of cities in the U.S. So
That's a great way to describe it. It
yeah,
totally feels like an Applebee's of the US.
totally. Yeah, it's fine. You know, you'll find something here you like, but it'll never be that great. So yeah,
I love it. Well, anyway, with all of that said, that you're associate professor, but you also just recently released an incredible book called American Idolatry: How Christian Nationalism Betrays the Gospel and Threatens the Church. And unbelievable book. Super excited to chat about it. But before we dive into it, who is
right.
Andrew Whitehead to Andrew Whitehead?
That's a great question.
Besides
Um,
having one of the coolest last names ever, because I mean, I bet at least somewhere down the line you're at least related to Alfred North Whitehead, who I'm a
I'm
big
gonna
fan of.
I'm gonna claim it. I'm gonna claim it. I don't know for sure. I need to dig into that, but yeah, that works for me. Yeah, I mean, it's so funny. I think really too with the book, part of it is kind of this personal journey. So who is Andrew to Andrew Whitehead? I think right now it's so much of it is recognizing the journey, of, and we'll talk more about this, of where we came from, where we are now, how much we know and really don't know, and just looking back on all that. So yeah, for me right now, it's a lot of the work of writing and being an academic, but then to just kind of walking through family stuff because I have some kids with special needs and disabilities, and so all of that just feels like this big mix
Mm.
that is kind of unsettling. So much of what I was handed growing up, where it's like, here are the answers, here's the tidy box, and it'll all work out. And then when it starts to unravel or not work out, then it becomes really clear. So that's the best I can describe it. It just feels like this muddled mess that I'm just trying to figure out, what's next. So
And sometimes people call that life.
yeah, totally. But not the folks, yeah, I think that handed us a lot of,
Right.
or at least me, what I was given. Yeah, so just finding that out and trying to find my way. So yeah, the journey, it just feels like it's, yeah, the journey.
Totally. Well, let's talk about the book. Before we dive into the contents of the
Yeah.
book, I want to hear a little bit more, just kind of the writing process for you while writing the book. Is this your first book, by the way?
It is my second.
Okay.
Yeah, so the first book I co-authored with Sam Perry,
Oh, that's
called
right.
Taking America Back for God. So that was our kind of, it's to a broad audience, but more of an academic, accessible academic book around Christian nationalism.
Right, right. That's right. I forgot about that book.
No worries.
So with that said, then,
Yeah,
what was something that you learned, maybe like kind of factually, in writing this book that you didn't know before? Obviously you're a sociologist, so you're looking at lots of data all the time. You're looking at
right.
history, all those sorts of things. Was there anything in the research for this book that came up where you're like, wow, I had no idea about that before? Obviously, writing a book about Christian nationalism, something that you've already written about before, you probably have
Yeah.
a good sense of like where you're going with this book, and you probably aren't like too surprised by a lot of things when you're researching, but was there anything in the research for this book that was a little surprising for you?
Yeah, that's always such a good question. And I think, for me, it's kind of like when we look back. So for sociologists, trying to get a really good handle on where we are now, what people believe, what is kind of influencing how they see their social worlds, how they interact within them, we have to look back and know our history to gain that context. And so yeah, like you said, a lot of it is reading history, but that so many times feels like peeling an onion where there's always more layers. And so
Or like an
like
ogre?
yeah, totally. Exactly. And so when, looking back or continuing to read, and just for me, I think it always felt like there were more layers. So the doctrine of discovery, and it's not just like when the U.S. was founded in this narrative as a Christian nation, but like even 200 years before that, like how
Mm,
those theologies were being created, and how impactful those were, and how, quote unquote good Christians were using their faith to make sense of how and why they could slaughter Native American people, and they could enslave African people, and just making sense of all that. So many times it's just another story, like the Pequot War, and hearing, reading quotes of what Europeans were saying, and how this was God's design. We needed to slaughter them. Um, I think those always are surprising. That always is like, goodness gracious, like
mhm,
here yet again, we see more evidence of this. So I think that's
mhm,
probably one thing.
mhm, absolutely. Was there anything that you learned about yourself as you wrote the book that you didn't know about before? Again, it's not your first book, but I would imagine something comes up in the book writing process where you're like, "Didn't know I had that in me."
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think in some ways it's kind of like a coin. So there, the good side, I think what I found out is like, hey, I can do this. I can, because this book is, I make normative claims in it, so that's moving beyond, the data. Like, we can't gather data on, is this a more like, um, helpful, or a better interpretation of the gospel, right? But in the book, I make, hey, here's at least one expression of the gospel that I think is less harmful. So knowing that I could write a book like this, and kind of make those claims, and do it in a way that hopefully is engaging, I think that was like a good thing I learned. The opposite side of that, and this was a really funny thing, and I don't know if this is what you're getting at, but I was writing the book, and anybody that writes knows that you have really low moments where you're just like, this is all crap. Like, I don't know how this is ever going to come together. All these things. And I would look back to writing my first book with Sam and think, oh, this co-authoring was so much better, because I could just write and then send it to him, and then he would work with it, and it was this wonderful experience. But then in the midst of writing this book, I looked back at journal like entries that I had written, and I was like, oh, everything I write sucks. Sam hates everything I send him. I know this is horrible. All these things that I was saying to myself with this book, I said then too. And so the big thing I found out about myself is that no matter what, I think in the moment I'm doing a horrible job, but I just have to keep pushing through, and it'll happen, and it'll work. So that's the big thing I found out. So that was pretty funny to me.
I would imagine a lot of, like, creative people in general probably experience that, whether it's
I think
musicians
so.
or, some sort of artists, whatever it might, certainly people who are authoring books. It just feels like a very common experience where it's like, this feels like just total and utter shit,
Yeah.
but when you send it out to the world to, for the world to engage, and then you
Right.
realize like, "Oh, wait, it must not have been that, like, terrible if other people seem to
Yeah.
really like it."
Totally. And I mean, even later, like once the book's coming together and I would read it, there were times where it's like, oh, you know what? This is pretty good. Like, I'm proud of this. Like, I'm ready for other people to read this. And I've heard that too. Like you said, other authors, it's this just up and down, up and down. So yeah, just trying to continue that on, where it isn't just always success,
Mhm.
and like beauty. But yeah.
Well, let's talk about your favorite thing to talk about, Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
So, before talking about the dangers of Christian nationalism, which is obviously what the book is all about,
Yeah.
how are you defining Christian nationalism in this book? Obviously, there's probably lots of different ways that people define Christian nationalism, and that might be part of the really difficult part of talking about Christian nationalism
Yeah.
because the definition seems so amorphous and not necessarily really agreed upon. So, it's like, how are we going to talk about something that like people really don't necessarily agree that we're all talking about the same thing and everything? So, anyway,
Yeah.
as you're talking about in the book, how are you talking about or defining Christian nationalism?
Yeah, so I define Christian nationalism as a desire to see a very particular expression of Christianity privileged in the public sphere, and that the
Mm,
American US government vigorously defends this expression of Christianity as the organizing framework for society. So, one of the things you're pointing out, which is true, is there's folks that will say, oh, what's the definition? Or nobody has one, nobody's looked at this. And so I push back on that a little bit in the book, where, you know, social scientists, we've kind of provided an empirically supported definition where it isn't just us saying this is what we think it is, but as we gather data and survey data, we see that this is what the American public is thinking about when it's thinking through this cultural framework of Christian nationalism. And so there's all this cultural baggage that comes with it. But essentially, again, the important point is this particular expression of Christianity, which is culturally, politically, religiously conservative, ethnocentric, has elements of authoritarianism in it, and a strict view of a moral hierarchy to society. So all these things are wrapped up within it. And so when we're talking about Christian nationalism, that's the expression of Christianity that we're looking at. And that's basically what throughout this book and a lot of our work, what we're able to show has a really distinct influence on how Americans view democracy, how they view gender, sexuality, the Christian faith, immigration, all these different things.
I'm really excited later on to talk about what kind of particular Christianity it is that
Yeah.
is Christian nationalism or is a part of Christian nationalism, as you mentioned, because it does seem like it is a particular kind of Christianity, but
Mm-hmm.
something that I'm not even necessarily familiar with, which might be a little strange for people, but we'll talk about that later.
Yeah.
At the beginning of the book, you mention that the way that both of us really grew up was that
Yeah.
we thought the greatest danger to Christianity wasn't Christian nationalism, it was secularism, right?
Yeah. Right.
That the greatest threat, the greatest danger to Christianity was something outside of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're arguing is actually it's actually coming from within. The greatest threat, the greatest danger
Yeah.
to Christianity is coming from within, obviously with Christian nationalism. So, but why is it that you think that so many of us were led to believe that the danger was coming from the outside rather than within?
Yeah, I think, a lot of this comes back to what we know about how social groups function and how they work. So the best way to create a really strong in group is to project and understand the boundaries against a really strong out group. So the more that we know what we're against and who we're afraid of, the more likely we are to circle the wagons, to protect ourselves, to fall in line, right? And to look to leaders to show us the way, to tell us what to do and what to think, and to know, okay, we are together in this. And that feeling of being embattled really brings a group together. And so I think for those kind of political operatives who, Christian nationalism goes back centuries, but when we're looking at our current context, we're really responding to the rise of the religious right,
Hmm.
in the 70s in response to the social upheaval of the 60s. And so for those folks in that moment, they knew to engage those political operatives, to engage even white evangelicals as a voting bloc. They needed to help them see themselves as a voting bloc, as a group. And to do
Mm.
that, you had to tell them over and over, this is who you're afraid of. This is who's coming after you. This is what you need to be, threatened by. And when you do that, and when you say, look, you're going to lose access to power, then that group comes together. It gets in line. It says, okay, now what do we need to do? How do we need to do it? And I think that's really what happens. So I think in our experience growing up, much of it was due to how social groups create a really strong in group is to be able to project a very strong and threatening out group.
Hmm. Well, I want to talk about like the current kind of examples of Christian
Mm-hmm.
nationalism at some point, but before that, I kind of want to hear more of the history of Christian nationalism. Where did it begin? And especially like kind of the more modern iteration of Christian
Mm-hmm.
nationalism. You talked a little bit ago about like the doctrine of discovery, and
Yeah.
certainly that plays a part in the history of Christian nationalism. But it isn't exactly like a direct line of what we're experiencing today. I often hear people say like, or at least argue that, maybe like the religious right and the rise of the religious right in the 50s,
Mm.
60s, and 70s is maybe a part of that. And that would maybe be some of the origins, but maybe you think it goes back even farther than that. But yeah, where would you say the modern iteration, what we understand to be Christian nationalism today, where did that begin? What's its origin story?
Yeah, definitely. I think the roots of that reach back even before the U.S. was founded. Like you said, some of these theologies being created to help kind of baptize this moving towards power and marginalizing other outgroups, however those are defined. And the thing with Christian nationalism is that it has reformed and responded to different moments in history. But I think our current iteration, like you said, really is in response to um, the latter half of the 20th century and the social upheaval of the 60s. So the gender, sexual revolution, the civil rights movement was a big part. So
Mhm.
the rise of the religious right then, I think, is what we're seeing, the fruits of that 40 years later. And
Mhm.
and so, with the election of Donald Trump, he was kind of the natural endpoint of much of that work. Like, this is the purest distillation of kind of what this group was okay with, right?
Mhm.
But when we look at Falwell and those leaders in the 70s, right, they're leaning on the Billy Graham and some of those folks from the 50s, and they're leaning on folks from the 1920s, and
Mhm.
that is related to in the Civil War period much of what was happening. So you can really trace it backwards. But I do think that this current moment iteration really is in relation to the rise of the religious right, which again was responding to the federal government changes around segregation, right?
Mhm.
And this idea of we should be able to, teach our kids. So this is going to resonate with today, right? Parents need to have the right to teach their kids how they want. So you can't force us to desegregate our schools. We're just going to create Christian academies
Mhm.
that, lo and behold, are completely white. Um, the gender and sexual revolution, the ERA amendment, all of these things were a part of fomenting this idea of we need to engage and fight back to defend what we see as a nation that was created for us and should be aligned with what we view as a Christian society.
What's interesting, saying all of that, of like that's kind of where we see this beginning of this modern iteration of Christian nationalism, starting in the '60s with a lot of the civil rights movement and segregation, all of that. What's
Mm-hmm.
interesting is you haven't mentioned Roe v. Wade, which I tweeted a few days ago, and
Yeah.
talked a little bit about, there is a lot of agreement that the rise of Christian nationalism, the rise of the religious right, really was more in response to segregation in the civil rights movement,
Mm-hmm.
rather than Roe v. Wade starting in, obviously, like the early '70s.
Yeah.
And certainly a lot of people get ticked off about that. They don't want like their religious, their conservative religious convictions to be really directly connected to the desegregation, or the segregation movement in the
Mm-hmm.
'60s, and the
Mm-hmm.
the opposition of the civil rights movement. But it certainly seems like there's a lot of good history to suggest that that was the case, and that actually did predate Roe v. Wade. And then once they realized that that was probably going to fail, that this movement against the civil rights movement, that's when Roe v. Wade kind of enters the picture, and they really
Mm-hmm.
obviously focus on that for a good 50 years and still do to this day. I just find that history really interesting. And when we're talking about Christian nationalism,
Mm-hmm.
at least in this book, it seems as if one of the things that's important is to recognize that I think what is implied here is a white Christian nationalism.
Right.
And again, with that being kind of implied throughout this book, again, it really directly ties to some of those origins, clearly being out of this racist conviction, where it was very against segregation, or it was very pro segregation, and
Mm-hmm.
certainly against the civil rights movement. And so we see that white Christian nationalism from that point to where we're at today.
Yeah, definitely. I think, in the book, it's really important too to highlight, and I try to show this, where when we're talking about Christian nationalism in the US, this religious nationalism, it really is tied to whiteness. And so calling it white Christian nationalism is important. And so when we're talking about whiteness, we're not talking about necessarily the skin color of the person who, embraces Christian nationalism, but that Christian nationalism as a cultural framework is tied to this idea of whiteness, where whiteness is this idea that society is structured in such a way that a particular group, and in this case white Americans, tend to benefit most from all the benefits that society offers. So different attitudes, beliefs, values, all these things move in such a way where white folks benefit more from it. And Christian nationalism, as we look through the years and especially recently, it tends to uphold those different systems that return, as a whole, as a group, positive results for white Americans. So again, it isn't as though like every single white American does better than every other minority. But when we look at the group level, white Americans have 13 to 15 times the wealth that any other minority group has. When we look at our criminal justice system, by and large, minorities, are 2 times as likely to be on death row, or to be incarcerated. As we look at maternal and child health, Black mothers die 2 to 3 times more in childbirth, and Black babies die in the first year, at a factor higher than white babies. So when we're looking at these group level statistics, we can see that this society that we live in is racialized. It isn't equal. And so when we think through why that is, Christian nationalism as a cultural framework is one of those reasons that tends to obscure this ability to see that inequality and why it's there. Like, how did we get here?
Mhm.
Because it creates explanations that this country was founded by God, and the way that it works is God's design, and it's up to individuals to do what they need to do. And all of those different things are a part of this story. And so when we're looking at Christian nationalism, it really is a white Christian nationalism.
Mhm. So that's a little bit about the history of kind of the modern iteration of
Mm.
Christian nationalism. Let's talk about some of the more recent examples that we have seen of this white Christian nationalism in America. Can you talk about some of the maybe more overt examples you have seen over the last few years?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's been really interesting to watch because, as we look at Donald Trump as a candidate, he's not the first Republican to use this rhetoric, right, of the U.S. as a Christian nation to say that we need to get back to that. But he was the first one that was willing to use this rhetoric really strongly, and then personally, as an individual, make really no effort to seem like a Christian, where other Republican candidates would at least say, yeah, I'm, interested in this, or I think it's important for me personally. And so he really was the perfect test of the power of Christian nationalism, where it isn't about the person individually, it's about whether they're going to privilege this group and this group's
Mm,
vision for society. And that's what he did. And for all the things about Trump that we could talk about, he is skilled at sensing what connects with an audience, right? So he just rambles for an hour, but he can sense, like, okay, that line hit, and he'll just use that. And you can see over the time as a candidate, and then when he won and as president, he leans in more and more to that Christian nationalist rhetoric. And so I think that's one really obviously strong example. And we see some of this, not only rhetoric, but this term, right, fomenting in the conversation more and more, till now we have, Marjorie Taylor Greene saying, hey, I'm a Christian nationalist. Republican Party needs to be the party of Christian nationalism, all of these things. So now kind of this desire to adopt the term and to say that, oh, we'll just redefine it and say it's a good thing. And so there's been a really interesting kind of change over the last couple of years, even. But I think more and more we see candidates leaning into it explicitly. And in the
mm,
midterms in 2022, some of those folks didn't do well, like Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania, the lady running for governor, I forget her name, in Arizona, who lost. They lost their races. So a candidate really leans into it, they might win their primary, because usually only folks that vote in primaries are like super, super into it. But then when they go to the general, it doesn't do as well. But other
mhm,
folks that kind of sprinkle it in like seasoning, they did fine. They won their re-elections. And so it'll be interesting to track. So we do see some of that. And probably, one last example where we see this really kind of out front is the Reawaken America tour,
mm,
that Michael Flynn and others are leading, where those are like literal religio-political revivals, where they're constantly talking about, this expression of Christianity and how it has to be brought back, and given power, and we need to bring the US back to this. And so it really is, spreading this Christian nationalist message across the US, and, not only with implications for democracy, but I think too, for those folks that are there who then go back to congregations, implications for how they understand, what it means to be a Christian, and what that should look like in the public sphere. So,
mhm,
yeah, there's a lot happening and a lot moving, but those are some of the examples that come to mind.
mhm. Would you say that there's more of like an awareness now of Christian nationalism than there has been maybe in the past. Like, obviously, people like Falwell have been in politics for quite some time. It's not like
Mhm.
the strategies are new or anything like that.
Yeah,
You know, this has again been going around since the 60s, 70s, 80s. So it's been going along for a while. But would you say that like the general public's awareness of how potent Christian nationalism is and how much influence it actually does have in American politics, do you think there's more of a general awareness of that now than there was 30, 40 years ago? Because you know, as much as like a lot of the strategies, a lot of the rhetoric doesn't seem new to me. You know, I remember
yeah,
hearing this stuff back in the George Bush years, and but it
yeah,
just seems like now that, and maybe it's just because of Trump, but it just seems like there is a full awareness, even from people who have like no relationship to Christianity at all, that like,
right.
oh, there is specifically a Christian type of nationalism that's going on.
Mm.
And I don't know, it just seems like that to me from my like general sense, but I have no
Yeah,
data to back that up or anything. So I'm curious, like what your, because you're an expert in this, like what your sense of that is for the
yeah.
general public and their awareness of white Christian nationalism.
Yeah, no, there's a couple of things. So PRRI, they gathered some data this past spring, or I guess it was just early 2023, where they asked about general awareness of the term. And most Americans don't really have a deep understanding of that term, haven't really heard about it. So in that sense, it is a term that for those of us that are online or just thinking about religion, politics generally, we're very aware. But for most Americans, it isn't a term that they've necessarily heard of. For those that have, PRI found that they tend to have a negative view of it. So they understand that and see it as something that's generally kind of negative or bad.
Hmm.
But I would say, though, for those that are kind of, in this space of religion, politics, reading, or tracking kind of American Christianity, I think that that term has risen in folks knowing about it, hearing about it, because it has helped provide a framework for what we all saw and grew up with, or that we saw generally. Or I've had folks come up to me and talk about that term or this book was helpful because it helped me make sense of, like, the last Thanksgiving around the table, like what I was hearing from these people and these folks. Like, okay, that's what it is. It just provides this framework to slot in, all of these different messages and terms and values and symbols that before were all kind of, floating around and we were aware of. But now it's like, okay, I can see what this is and how it functions and
Hmm.
what it's doing, you know, in our culture, in our society, or, among individuals. So I think in that sense, it provided kind of a framework that folks could then, yeah, understand or perceive their experiences through. So in that way, I think it has risen in just a general understanding of what it is.
Mm. You mentioned, one of the arguments in your
Mm,
book is that Christian nationalism betrays the gospel itself. And I've actually made like a similar argument in a YouTube video a while back. I think I released it sometime in this like last calendar year. But
yeah.
yeah, I made a similar argument where I talked about how Christian nationalism really uses Christian language
Hmm.
for the sake of political power, but it doesn't have like some sort of robust theology. Since to me, it's all just Christian language, it's all talk.
Mm,
And I think like someone like Trump and even like James Lindsay are great examples of this, where it's people who clearly are not like Christian people. In fact, James Lindsay, I think, has been like outright that he's an atheist,
yeah. Right.
but they use that Christian language
Mm,
in order, again, for the sake of this political power for Christian nationalism. I'm really curious what you think about that, as it sort of not only betrays the gospel, but in some way, shape, or form, it doesn't even necessarily seem all that Christian, other than just using Christian language. And this kind of gets to what you talked about before about Christian nationalism using a particular form of Christianity. What I'm curious about is it doesn't even seem to be all that Christian. In
mm.
in one sense, it doesn't seem to be all that Christian. And so I'm really curious what you think about kind of that argument.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so I think a couple things. So Christian nationalism, I define it as a cultural framework, can operate in a number of different ways. And my colleague Sam Perry has made this point too in his work, where it can be kind of a political tool, right? So when we're looking at James Lindsay or we're looking at Donald Trump, they sense that this this cultural framework can be used to benefit them, to bring folks to their side, right? And so they can use this language. So it doesn't really matter if they, are atheist or whatever. They can use this language, and it'll essentially, the people that need to hear it will hear it. They'll know what's being talked about, and they will come and support you. So in that sense, I think that's true. And so there, it's, really is just kind of a political tool, and that's where it ends. But I think too, there are many Americans and Christian Americans who, assent to kind of the Orthodox beliefs, but then when it comes to how they live out their Christian life or witness or whatever you want to call it, Christian nationalism in that point really is very Christian to them, in the sense that these cultural beliefs that come with it, that folks, from outside that kind of walk of life would see, like, you don't have to defend the Second Amendment to be a Christian. Like, there's literally nothing about defending the Second Amendment that would, and I think some of us who are more progressive would say the opposite, but like, they see it as like, if we don't defend the Second Amendment, then we are turning our back on the Christian God. And so in that sense, I think it is very Christian, but it's just adding in a lot of this other cultural baggage to how they understand it. And so in that sense, I think, yeah, it really is for them very Christian. And so we have to understand it and see it as, again, that particular expression of Christianity is very real. So just understanding too, and making the case that there are many expressions of Christianity. This is one, but it's particularly powerful, and our history in the US, it's been particularly powerful and influential, and it continues to be, and understanding it on those terms. But yeah, I think for me then too, with my book and in aligning with what you had to say, I think that normatively, like moving beyond the data, right? If Christians are supposed to be about the flourishing of not only, their group, but those outside their group, I think Christian nationalism is fundamentally opposed to that. And
Right.
so we could make the normative claim that, like, that isn't necessarily following Christ. But I think for me, I tend to say, well, they they have just as much of a right to say that this is Christianity as I do. But I just think they're wrong, and they'll, have to see that at some point. We have to kind of push back against them however we can with levers of power or whatever else. But yeah, just to say that they're like outside the faith, we probably can't do that either, because again, there's cultural expressions that we have, that hold on to this as well.
Yeah, I'm not really interested in making the argument on like whether or not these people are Christian or whatnot. Like that
Yeah.
to me is an uninteresting debate. What
Yeah.
I think is more interesting is how Christianity or Christian identity is used in these Christian nationalist circles. And
Yeah.
what I think is really interesting is generally Christian nationalist people tend to be more gatekeepy around like who's Christian, who's in, who's out, right?
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Especially growing up in white evangelicalism, like who, what it means to be a Christian is very gatekeepy. Like you have to,
Yeah.
accept Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior, all of that, right?
Yeah.
What's interesting though is you have people like Donald Trump and James Lindsay who are
Mm,
not participating in the Christian identity
yeah.
that most of these people tend to gatekeep around. So
Yeah.
all of a sudden, when you have people that are able to get you access to political power, you are willing to lower those gates for them. Even though that they aren't culturally participating in their institutions. Trump never
Totally.
went to youth group. He didn't go to Promise Keepers. He
Yeah.
he didn't go to Liberty University. He didn't get
Yeah.
married at 20 and, have like 2.5 kids at 23. Like he
Yeah.
didn't participate in all the cultural pieces that makes Christian identity within these circles of
Yeah.
how they understand Christian identity. So it's really interesting how they're willing to make exceptions for certain people given the political access to power that they can get from these certain individuals. That to me is
Yeah.
really interesting on how they think about Christian identity based on all of that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's what's so helpful about Christian nationalism, is making sense of this fact that it really does come down to power and fear of who the other is. So if you have a person that can give you access to power, protect you from fear and threat of who we've defined as the other, we can create all sorts of explanations, right? The kind of like Trump as a metaphor of, a modern day kind of King Cyrus, all these different things that we can read back into the Bible, and are willing to do, because He'll provide access to power, protect us from what we see as what we should, fear or be threatened by. Use violence if we need to protect ourselves, all of these different things. So I think that's where the power of Christian nationalism really becomes apparent.
Mm-hmm. What do you think the average person, or like why the average person gets into Christian nationalism? Like, I understand why people like Trump get into it because of the rewards, not only
Mm-hmm.
that Christian nationalists get, but also that Trump gets out of that. Wh- but why do you think like the average just church going evangelical or whoever it is
Yeah.
would become entrenched into the world of Christian nationalism? I think about just the people I grew up with in South Dakota that I don't know if they would self-identify as Christian nationalists, but they certainly play the part in all the things that we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Why would that average person who's just going to work 9 to 5 every day
Yeah.
get entrenched in that world when it really doesn't actually reward them with the political power that it would for someone like Trump?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it has to do with, looking back at my own journey where you're born and where you grow up, it just kind of is the way the world is, right? It's not even
Mm,
something that anybody perceives around them, but this idea that if you're an American, you're Christian, and if you're a good Christian, you support America and whatever America decides to do, and its past is, full of victory and triumph and God's blessing. And that is just the way the world is. And very few things are in some of those bubbles that would help folks contradict that or raise questions in their mind. And so I think for most Americans, that narrative is just so widely accepted that it just gets handed down and accepted. And so I think that's a part of it. And then I think too, there is, kind of a political project in there as well, especially over the last 40 or 50 years, where if we're to be a good Christian, you have to vote the right way. You have to defend what we see as important in the public square. And we were given tools of how to understand politics, what are moral issues, and then what's just politics, right? So
mm,
being pro-life, quote unquote, which means anti-abortion, that is a moral issue. You have to vote a certain way if you're going to be a good Christian. But racial inequality, that's just politics, right? That isn't a moral issue. That isn't a pro-life issue. That's just politics. And so being able to define what is what, I think, that's part too of bringing people into this narrative and giving them the values and symbols that really make up Christian nationalism. It really is so ubiquitous at this point that it's just how people see the world. And so even though it can cause them to vote against, and this isn't anything new, a lot of people point this out, but cause them to vote against their interests, right?
mm,
Because they feel as though, well, capitalism and, the ability of folks to be billionaires or whatever, that is God's will. That's just how it works. You just got to work hard because someday I may do that, when reality is really nobody is going to be able to do that. But it's just the way this world has been structured. But all of that has a history and is a part of this ongoing framework, right? Aligning it with this is how God designed it. This is what we need to do. But that was all political projects at different points in history.
mhm. You mentioned a while back here in this conversation that Trump seems to be this like ultimate manifestation
Yeah.
of what this trajectory of white Christian nationalism has been over the
Mm,
last several decades.
yeah.
And I'm curious about like why you think that is and what happens after Trump. Right? Like
Mm,
once you get to this sort of savior of white Christian nationalism, what
yeah.
happens when that savior maybe, at some point Trump's going to die or Trump, whatever.
Mm,
Like at some point you lose that savior. What happens to the movement after that? So I'm really curious, like,
yeah.
not only why you think Trump is sort of this ultimate manifestation of white Christian nationalism, but also what happens to white Christian nationalism after you lose a leader like him.
Yeah. Well, I think, and this is a point too that like Kristen Dumais makes in her book, Jesus and John Wayne, and others have too, where this idea of Trump as the natural endpoint, with this social movement and the politics that were embraced, it really was always about power and access to power. And there were moments where you could kind of cloak it in a veneer of taking the high road, right? We need to be moral people, da da da, right? And so one great kind of data point on this is asking basically evangelical Christians and many Americans, but the difference with evangelical Christians was so apparent. Does a leader have to be moral to be president? And so, a couple of decades ago, 70% of evangelicals said, yes, you have to be a moral person if you're going to be president and lead. Because really they were responding to the Bill Clinton years and just all that happened there, right? This guy is immoral. He should not be leading this nation. And then that same question was asked in the last couple of years when Trump was on the scene, and it literally flipped. Now only 30% of evangelical Christians said you need to be moral to be president. 70% disagree now. So there was a complete setting aside of what was viewed as, we got to have moral leaders. Now it was, no, we need leaders who are going to protect us and our interests. And so Trump, I think, is that perfect distillation, because Christian nationalism is about power and access to power. And if a leader is willing to give that, all bets are off, right? Like we will forgive whatever. We'll say we don't need a pastor in chief, right? We just need a strong leader. We need somebody willing to punch the bully in the mouth, right? So I'm just quoting what these kind of famous pastors and religious leaders have said about Trump. So I think that's why he's the perfect distillation. Now, what happens after? That is really difficult to tell, because I think he has really reshaped, especially on the right, how politics works and what it means. And there's so little now left that is truly conservative, right? It really isn't conserving anything. Like, it's willing to burn down whatever to gain access to power. And so, I think while Trump will disappear, Trumpism is here to stay. And it will just take like a concerted effort for many Americans to push back against this desire to, ignore reality, ignore truth and fact, and to live kind of in this conspiratorial bubble. All those things are with us. And so putting that back, I don't think that's possible. But it'll have to just lose enough politically to then, turn away those folks that have embraced it. So yeah, I think his style is going to be with us for decades. What, obviously he won't be, but I think that style of politics is here.
And like you mentioned, a lot of these white Christian nationalists don't think that a president has to be moral anymore. But again,
Mm-hmm.
like I kind of mentioned before, they don't even a president even doesn't even necessarily have to be all that Christian.
No,
And again, I find that so fascinating that this movement of it did seem like maybe 30, 40 years ago, if you were to be somebody that was big in the religious right world, you at least had to know, like you had to talk the talk, you had to graduate from Dallas, theological seminary or something like that.
yeah.
Like you had to like demonstrate your qualifications of how Christian you were, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now that doesn't even matter. That to me seems to be a really fast maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there have been plenty of examples of
Yeah.
that over the last 50, 60 years of leaders within this religious right Christian nationalist movement that didn't necessarily have to be all that Christian. But
Yeah.
it does, at least from my little understanding of it, seems to be like a very jarring difference
Yeah.
over the last 50, 60 years, and has set a precedent. And I find that really, really fascinating of how that will play out, given the fact that somebody doesn't necessarily have to be all that culturally Christian. They can say 2 Corinthians and people don't shake their heads about that. Like,
Yeah.
but 60 years ago, if Falwell said that, people would be like, wait, like, are you actually even a Christian? Like
Yeah.
that suspicion has totally gone away. And I find that really fascinating. Anyway, I'm just
What?
like so
Yeah.
focused in on that point. I
Yeah.
find that so fascinating that somebody doesn't even have to be participating all that culturally with
Yeah.
Christianity in order to be a leader within
Yeah.
Christian nationalism.
Well, I think some of the seeds of that were sown, right, with the religious right turning on Jimmy Carter and moving to Ronald Reagan. So Ronald Reagan, famously was divorced and, was this movie star, but they saw in him, somebody that could kind of get people excited and was willing to listen to them. And he ultimately didn't deliver everything they wanted, but I think that was like that first move in that direction. Right. And so then that just continued on to where Trump is kind of this, you know, flowering of the seeds that were planted even back then. So it was always kind of there. It's just that now it became just distilled and very apparent and revealed in that sense.
Hmm. I interviewed Isaac Sharp a few months ago about his book, The Other Evangelicals,
Yeah.
and I know you're very well aware of that book. Great, great book. One of the things that, and I don't remember if I like left it in the interview, but at one point Isaac and I talked a little bit about his optimism or pessimism of
Yeah.
white evangelicalism in
Yeah.
particular, and whether or not he thinks evangelicalism can actually be reformed, given its history of clearly gatekeeping people that
Yeah.
they deem aren't evangelicals, even if there are people that say they're still evangelical or whatnot.
Yeah.
One of the sort of like with that book in mind, and also reading your book, one of the questions I keep, like, having in my mind is
Mm.
specifically white evangelicalism. Does it inevitably lead to something like Christian nationalism?
Mm.
Like, does it just its theology, its politics, what it stands for, will it just ultimately lead to it? Whether or not it's at that point yet for somebody, but at some point, it does seem like if you're committed enough to be a white evangelical, maybe it will inevitably lead you to Christian nationalism. I'm really curious, like, what you think about that.
Yeah. No, I think I really go back and forth where I do think, institutionally, white evangelicalism, whether that can be reformed, I have a lot of doubts because so much is wrapped up, so much money and power and influence is wrapped up in maintaining essentially white Christian nationalism. And so I don't know that those can be reformed or turned back. The people in seats of power there aren't going to reform it because then a lot of that influence and power leaves.
Absolutely.
But I think there are, at the individual level, especially among younger folks who identify as evangelical or growing up in those spaces, I think it doesn't necessarily lead to embracing Christian nationalism. I think the possibility is much higher, right? If you're in those spaces, because that's where it's fomented and passed along and in these congregations. But I do think young folks as they go to college and as they interact with other groups, they want to hold on to an expression of the faith, but they're very wary, or they really outright reject this gatekeeping desire of kind of institutional white evangelicalism and Christian nationalism that turns them against people that they again were taught to love or care for, or see as a neighbor. They really sense that hypocrisy in many senses. So I'm hopeful for, at the individual level, there can be renewal, within this broader religious tradition. But I think institutionally and in those spaces, I think I'm much more cynical of whether there really is anything that can move beyond or outside of it. I hope so, but I'm really doubtful most days. And so I think that's kind of the distinction I would make.
Mhm.
And yeah, then it's just a question of how do we, keep pushing along, or, you know, if we even identify, or if I even identify as evangelical, or I'm, identified outside the group because I critique Christian nationalism, who knows? And whether that even matters, I don't know. But yeah, I think among individuals, it's not necessarily the case, but yeah, among organizations and institutions, I don't know that it can be turned back.
Mhm. That generational piece is really interesting to me.
Yeah.
We see this rise of Christian nationalism at a obviously national level, and certainly it seems like a lot of the leaders are obviously like lots of boomers, maybe some Gen Xers,
Yeah.
and certainly right now, like their main focus seems to be on LGBTQ people, specifically trans people, right?
Mhm.
But even among, like, the data I've seen is the younger generations of people who identify as evangelicals are becoming more and more accepting of LGBTQ people.
Right.
And that's one particular issue among many other issues within that world. Do you sense that there would be some sort of shift or division that happens
Mm.
between the Christian nationalist evangelicals as people get older, or is there some sort of generational divide where it's like all these Christian nationalists, like once they die, then they die out, and like the newer, more accepting younger generations of evangelicals obviously like eventually get in power or whatever? Like, I'm just
Yeah.
really curious how that generational piece,
Yeah.
uh, how do you take that into account with Christian nationalism?
Yeah, I think there's two ways to look at it. So one way, we do see kind of a demographic endpoint, because Americans that strongly embrace Christian nationalism are significantly older than those that maybe are just sympathetic to it or won't oppose it, or those that resist or reject it. So it gets younger as you move down the line, right? Those that are most opposed the mean age is much lower than those that embrace it really strongly. So there is going to be a demographic replacement, right? As those folks die out, they won't necessarily be replaced automatically, or at least we don't know. So then that leads to the other question is, as young people age, do they become more likely to then start embracing it more strongly, right? Or do they kind of maintain similar beliefs to what they had? Because if they don't move towards it more strongly, then we will see kind of this replacement and folks dying out. I think the answer with all social science is usually both. And I think there's going to be parts of that where, as young people, get married and get into these congregations and get into the institutions, they probably do start to embrace it more strongly, or can, and then others won't. But we do find that this number of Americans that strongly embrace it is shrinking some. But what's happening is that because they're shrinking, that identity of we are those that embrace this idea of a Christian nation becomes even more salient. So this is how they really understand themselves. And that's, I think, what makes them, really motivated to get out and vote and to really push for what they want, because they see themselves as the remnant. And so I think that's what continues to make it so relevant. And even though it's getting smaller, even though it's a lot of older folks, and there could be demographic replacement going on, it'll still be a kind of a powerful vocal minority. And so we'll have to see. But my hope is that, and I think it's true, that folks that have had more open, views towards LGBTQ Americans, they tend to not walk that back just because they get older. Maybe a little, but it isn't wholesale. Like that demographic shift is, I think, here to stay.
Yeah, it does seem like specifically LGBTQ is such a massive sociological shift
Yeah,
that is really fairly, I would say, I don't know if it's unprecedented, but it is a massive shift that has happened.
it is.
And it's,
Yeah,
it is that sociological shift and how it's even translated into more conservative Christian type of folks like evangelicals.
it's true.
And that seems pretty unprecedented. Like
Yeah,
there aren't too many other things like that throughout history that have that kind of
yeah.
significance.
When
And
I think
so
how
it
fast
really
it
is curious,
switched too.
right? And
Yeah,
it'll be really curious to see like how that will play out 50 years from now. As you know, it will be really fascinating, I think.
yeah, for sure.
No,
Yeah,
I
I
think you're
think.
right that there will probably be some like very strong vocal minority, but yeah, I it does seem like even among evangelicals, like it's gonna be really interesting how like the gatekeepers play this out, because they might lose half of their congregations at some point
Yeah.
in the next 25 years.
Yeah, no, I think it's moving that way. And that's the thing too. Like, not only has the switch been so quick. So when we look at national data, I mean, from early 2000s, 15 years later, like the number of Americans that embraced, legalization of same-sex marriage, like over doubled. Like that was so fast. But then when we look even among evangelical Protestants, or we look even among Americans who strongly embrace Christian nationalism, over a decade, their numbers doubled, right? So they're liberalizing their views as well, just not as quick as the general public, but they're still liberalizing. So
Hmm.
it is a broad scale change. It's happening at different speeds, but everybody is liberalizing in this direction. So yeah, it will be fascinating to track.
Hmm. You mention in the book that there are many Christians who are confronting Christian nationalism. Who
Mm.
are some of these folks, and like what is the work that they're doing that's confronting Christian nationalism?
Yeah, yeah. So in the book too, I wanted to highlight, like, really to try and make the case that not only does Christian nationalism betray the gospel, but that there are multitude of expressions of Christianity that are already doing this work of confronting it and embracing a vision of the gospel that is for the common good and the flourishing of all people. And so I try to highlight some of those examples. And what I'm excited to see too is that, as different religious groups or people are creative, that they'll find, ways that fit their particular situation, right? And come up with ways that we can push back, or that we can confront Christian nationalism in our communities. And so, a couple examples. One is of a childhood friend who started a nonprofit that essentially helped refugees coming to her community just connect with community resources, right? And that's really what it's focused on. And she was working with a middle-aged woman who kept trying to take the driver's test, but kept failing. And so it wasn't for lack of effort or anything. And while the test was offered in different languages and in this woman's native language, the manual was only offered in English. So she could never
Mm,
study, in her own language. So there was this clear, blockage. And so, in the book, I tell the story and try and point out that, this nonprofit could have worked to train every single person, or essentially teach them English so that they could then study the manual and then take the test and pass it. But what they did is they kind of looked at, well, what's causing the problem? What's the blockage? Well, the manual should be in different languages. So they ended up suing the state along with the ACLU to say, hey, this manual should be offered in different languages, not just the test. And the state agreed. And so now they offer it in different languages. And so she was able to accept this woman where she was and then see, well, how could she lift up the marginalized so that they have access to the benefits of the society? It isn't just like trying to keep them out or trying to get them to say the sinner's prayer, but like look at how they're being marginalized and what can we do? And that is an expression of, I think, a gospel that is for the common good. There's another group, a church in a community that, was working through racial injustice, post George Floyd, and saw that in their denomination, there was this kind of movement, decades ago to move towards racial justice, but that just fizzled out. They didn't end up doing anything. So this congregation was like, you know what, we are going to learn about this. And they did. And then they said, let's just gather money and, kind of help create this community group of leaders in the African-American community in their neighborhoods or in their community. We're just going to give them the money, no expectation of what they'll do with it or to report back, but we just need to take this one step of repair, and gathering funds and giving it to them because of what's been taken, historically. So that's what they did. And there were other congregations that were kind of, asking about it like, hey, we could be a part of it too. And it became apparent to this group, like these folks were like, well, how it will be spent or how will they report back? And they're like, that's not the point. The point is to give up control of, these funds, of our resources. That's what we need to do. That's an expression of the gospel. And so that's what they did. And so it really taught them. And so throughout the book, just trying to highlight some of those examples of how people were in their situation and recognizing need in their connection to the marginalized, right? To gain proximity to these groups and listen and understand, okay, this is where they're hurting. This is what they need. Now, how can we leverage what we have or our privilege to help lift them up? And so, yeah, those are just two of the examples, but I think that's some of the work that's taking place that is helpful, right? That we need to move towards to create, communities and a society where one group isn't always benefiting at the expense of others.
I love that, like, the way that you're describing this is the best way to just resist Christian nationalism is, like, do good in the world.
Yeah.
Which, like, I think exposes a little bit of the insidious nature of Christian nationalism, that it's just, like, simply evil, and so the way to resist it is just do good.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think, for me growing up, white, male, straight, Protestant, the world is just kind of like formed for me. Right. And so doors open that I never knew could be closed for anybody else. And so as I listen to these voices and these experiences, my hope is that Christians would be moved with empathy toward them and then do good. Like how can we help them have the same rights and benefits that I've always enjoyed, right? That have been there for me. And so in that sense, it really is that simple. And then it gets complicated, but the idea, right, is looking at those systems, right? Not just individuals, but there are systems that are keeping groups and communities down. So how can we reform them?
How do you hope American Idolatry inspires and liberates its readers?
Yeah, I think my hope really is that it would reach folks that, there's some Americans that strongly embrace Christian nationalism, true believers. I doubt that they're going to change their minds on a book. But I think there's a lot of American Christians who maybe just stay silent, right? When folks are saying, like, we need to put in God we trust in all the schools, or we need to ensure that, we can, make sure our Christian principles are paramount. And they won't necessarily, do that vocally, but a lot of Americans will just kind of stay quiet with it and not really see how that affects religious minorities or secular Americans or racial and ethnic minorities. So my hope is that some of those folks might read this book and recognize where they're at on this journey, and that I haven't arrived, that I have still more to learn, still more to understand about how, even where I'm at today, might say or believe things that still privilege, Christianity in some way that could harm others. And so to see themselves as on a journey, that this is a part of that journey, and to give them maybe some tools to understand where they came from or where to go next. But that it isn't something that we can like amputate, like,
Mm.
okay, we took care of Christian nationalism, but that again, it's like flossing, right? Like we do it every day and we have to do it to stay healthy. We have to just continue to look to see how maybe, we're privileging a particular expression of Christianity or not moving towards a world where all can participate and have an equal voice, those types of
Mhm.
things. So yeah, I think just recognizing the journey and not feeling ashamed at where you're at, but just making the decision to now start moving in a direction towards flourishing.
Mhm. I've heard anti-white supremacy kind of be described in the same way where
Yes.
it's a daily practice, and
Yep.
so I think
Yeah.
anti-Christian nationalism is just another one of those things we have to add to our skincare routine.
Yeah, totally. Well, that, and then too, that we can do together, right? So appreciating like your voice and others where we're we're a part of a broader community, right? And we can disagree on some stuff, but we can agree that crushing some of these groups or harming them in this way is not flourishing, is not, an expression of the gospel that we would hopefully want. So yeah, just we're on a journey, and that there are others journeying with us, I think, is what gives me hope.
Love it. Last question, Andrew,
Yeah.
how can listeners get connected to you and your work?
Yeah. So I'm on social media. So X or Twitter, whatever, on there, and Instagram. And yeah, I'm actually working with Brad Onishi. So the Straight
Mhm.
White American Jesus podcast, he just started a broader podcast group. And so I'm creating a limited series just about Christian nationalism and the threat to
Oh,
democracy, the threat to the gospel. And so that'll be coming out in a couple weeks. So folks can look for that. But yeah, on social media, that's where I mostly stay engaged. So yeah, would
love
love
it,
to
love it.
connect.
Well, thank you so much for writing the book. It was great and wonderful, and, yeah, loved chatting more about it.
Yeah, thanks so much.